Streaming?
Yeah. Yes, we are.
Look, my apologies for the slight delay. Let's get into it then. Our council workshop for today is in respect of our representation review. Joe, thank you. We have your documents. The floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. We've got Stephen Hill here from elections.com again to take you through this second presentation. So I will start by handing over to you and welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Joe. Can I just check you can all hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
That's great.
Right.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Joe. Let's just get underway. Look, first of all, thanks for having me back to take you through this session, which follows on from our previous work and brings back a number of items for your consideration. My suggestion today as we go through the workshop is that Joe and I will take you through the presentation. Happy to pause on the way through for any questions of clarification, but it's probably helpful if we can get through the main points. We've got some recap, some reporting back on the preliminary engagement, and then just a reminder about the options that are in front of you for thinking about, and then perhaps allow time for discussion once we've gone through those key parts of the presentation. So just to cover what the focus is for today, and keeping in mind that this is not a decision-making meeting, but it is one where we are seeking guidance from you as elected members as to what you would like staff to bring back to the council. So we just want to do a quick recap of where we've come from, the steps taken to date. We'll have a look at an overview of the results and feedback from the preliminary consultation, the engagement that we've had with the community over the past month or so. We will take another look at the options that you asked us to take out in that preliminary engagement, and there were two primary options, but also keeping in mind that we have the option of status quo as well. And then after we've gone through those, then it's really a matter of discussion and getting guidance from you as to, as I said, which option that you would like staff to work up as the basis for the initial proposal. Just moving on to a quick reminder of the timeline. We are working to the timeline that's set under the legislation, and our first target date, key date, is the 31st of July, being the line in the sand for the last date by which councils can resolve their initial proposal. And then there's a series of steps that flow on from that, and we've got some information on the proposed timeline a little bit later in the presentation. So just a quick recap then to remind you of where we have come from. First of all, going back to the decision to establish Māori representation that was taken in May 2021, so that option is now on the table as part of your representation structure. Just also a reminder, and we did touch on this at the last workshop, of the fact that there was a full representation review done in 2021. That was the last scheduled statutory review. So in fact, you're not required to do another representation review until 2027, but you do have the option of doing that currently, which is why we're working through this process now. And so just a reminder that in that process in 2021, there was quite a comprehensive review undertaken, looking at the structure of boards, the structure of community boards, and some changes were made and through that review, and that included a reduction in the councillor numbers at that time to bring the councillor numbers down to where you are currently. There was also the combining of the Parongia and Kakapuku wards, and there were some boundary changes that were taken on board for the community board areas. So that established really the structure that you have now. It went out for consultation, and it was ultimately endorsed by the Local Government Commission as well through that process. So coming into the current process that we're working through, again, just also a reminder that you have resolved to retain the first past the post voting system. So that decision was taken in June. And then in our last workshop at the end of May, we went through just fairly high-level overview of some of the background, the key requirements for a representation review, the factors that need to be considered, what the legislation sets out needs to be taken into account. We looked at some of the risks, obviously the fact that you are starting this process a little later than would be ideal, so that does put a little bit of pressure on staff to do the work, but we've been able to work through all of those issues so far. And you indicated at that stage that the options that we should take out in that preliminary engagement were essentially the status quo with the 4 wards and the 11 councillors. If we were to go out with that as the initial proposal, there would have to be some boundary adjustments, and we've got some information on that through this presentation. But then the more significant change option would be to create the new rural ward. So that would effectively give us 3 wards with 8 councillors, so a reduction in councillor numbers being one of the key proposals there. Just a quick reminder about the changes to the Local Electoral Act. You're all well aware of that work that's been underway. We've been through a select committee process, but still not enacted at this stage. So just a reminder that under the transitional arrangements that are set out in that legislation, you would be required either to resolve to disestablish the Māori ward or to hold a binding poll alongside the 2025 local elections. One of the key points is that council's not in a position to make any decision on those arrangements until the bill is in fact enacted, which we are expecting to be in about a month's time, so sometime in late July. So all of the information in this presentation and the work that staff have been doing is on the basis that we continue with the representation review as it is currently in progress, and those decisions on the provision for Māori wards will be taken in due course. Okay, so preliminary engagement, we as it indicated, we undertook a fairly truncated and relatively quick, sharp preliminary engagement period from the end of May through to the 16th of June. We put some key questions up on the online platform. There were hard copy forms available as well, so people had options to consider. A total of 59 responses were received. From my experience, that's not a bad number for a relatively short-term survey. So one thing to keep in mind, I guess, with any of these preliminary engagement issues is that the survey and the responses, they are one view. They are a snapshot of a certain part of the community. They're a valuable input into the process, but they're not the only one. And so obviously we understand that it's not necessarily representative of the whole community, but it's a good way of gauging some of the temperature and the feel of the community on the questions that we put out. So the issue for you is to take this information as part of your thinking, but put that alongside your own experience and your own observations and your own networking with your communities. So the key questions that were asked were around the number of councillors that people were looking for, as well as the ward structure issues. And just on the previous slide, we did have a note that demographically, the large proportion of responses came from people in the general urban wards. So just another factor to keep in mind. So the survey asked people to indicate whether they thought the current number of councillors was about right, or too many, or too few. We see the numbers there, 21 saying about right, 32 saying too many, and 5 saying too few. One of the questions that's always interesting, this is again quite a common result when councils go out with this question. We often find that when you dig into those responses, people have made an assumption that fewer councillors means lower cost, and it's always important to remember that unless you're providing quite comprehensive information about the fact that fewer councillors doesn't necessarily mean lower cost and lower rates, that can have a skew effect on the results. So we asked people what number of councillors they thought would be appropriate, and we got a range of responses, ranging from 6 through to 10. We measured the number of times each of those was mentioned. There are some 0.5s in the table, as you can see, and that's because there were some people that said things like 8 or 9 or 6 or 7. So we counted those kind of both ways. So you can see that the highest number of mentions was for 8 councillors, and then the others were a little way behind across the span from 6 through to 10. So these are the highest ranked options. The range actually ran from 3 to 19. We've just done a little bit of work around looking at how those numbers would fit under the current and the proposed options. And certainly the 8 councillors does work, and that's one of the options that was out for preliminary engagement, but there were difficulties around some of the other numbers there. Okay, let's look at questions around representation generally. So we asked, did people feel that they were represented appropriately under the current structure, and very interesting, just an even split as to whether people felt that they were appropriately or not appropriately represented. And quite a close split again on the next question around, do you think the current structure of 4 general wards works well to represent the communities of interest across the district? But, the slight majority, yes, 30 people felt that, yes, that was the case, that the current structure worked well. Slightly lower number saying no. We asked some questions on rural representation. And this was a fairly general and open question, just asking people whether they thought rural areas should have separate representation from urban areas. And people said yes. 42 thought that was the case. 14 thought no was the case. One thing to bear in mind, there's an alternative option in the next question, but remembering that the current structure effectively does provide representation for rural areas separate from the urban, because we have 2 predominantly urban wards and 2 predominantly rural wards under the current structure. So then we said one option could be to have a combined, just flipping back to that previous one option could be to have a combined rural ward and 2 urban wards based around the current township-based wards. Again, quite close response, no clear or strong view either way. 27 thought that was an appropriate option, but 29 saying didn't prefer that. We did ask people to suggest any other options or to give comments, and there were some other options that were suggested. There were some respondents that suggested having smaller wards, so that would mean a larger number of wards. And we made some comment, just doing some initial analysis on some of these suggestions. Obviously, there's no detail here to model, but certainly with smaller wards, it would be difficult to achieve that fair representation compliance. There were some people that suggested east-west rural wards, which is effectively to some extent the current structure, because we have, apart from the 2 township-based wards, an east-west split between the 2 rural wards. Again, difficult to achieve the plus or minus 10% compliance. North-south rural wards was suggested, and we just noted that this was probably similar to some of the options that were explored last time around in the representation review. And the analysis then, we've got a slide on some of those 2021 options a little bit further in the presentation, but at that stage, and probably the same today, not considered to meet the communities of interest test. There were some suggestions of fully at-large basis of election with no wards. And again, that just goes, I guess, contrary to the position that council has worked through in its previous representation reviews to say that, yes, there are particular communities of interest across the district, which we think are currently best represented by the ward structure that we have. There's a suggestion about splitting Cambridge into two. Again, I think this is one where you would effectively be dividing an existing community of interest and would potentially fail on the community of interest test, but also difficult to achieve compliance with the 10% requirement. Again, there were some suggestions around a 3-ward structure, including some amalgamation, some combining of different areas that you can see noted there. And again, these were, we had it from an initial look, not felt to be meeting the communities of interest test or to provide effectively for that representation. And there was an element of this was kind of squashing areas together that didn't really match in terms of their communities of interest. So probably not ideal there. Joe, I don't know whether you've got any other comment perhaps on those parts of the discussion?
No, I think that all covers it. And I think, we can, when we get to further on in the presentation, look at some of those other solutions that have come forward this time that we modelled last time. But we did spend time looking at kind of these alternative options that people did bring forward as part of that pre-engagement.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Joe. So that brings us on to, I guess, looking at the representation options that we have to consider. And what we've done, as well as the option 1 and option 2 that we talked about last time, we've also brought back to you to keep on the table that there is effectively an option 0, which is the do nothing option. So there is the option to simply retain the status quo. There is no need to go through the formal representation review process. And under that scenario, the status quo would remain and no change. So that option remains on the table. So then we have the 2 options that were looked at last time. And option 1 is effectively almost the same, just retaining the current structure, but with some boundary adjustments so that we achieve the plus or minus 10% compliance and retaining the 11 councillors as currently in place. Option 2, again, just as a reminder, we'll go through this in a minute, but is the option of the new rural ward. So 3 general wards and 1 Māori ward, and a total of 8 councillors. And then there are, potentially the option of other arrangements that are on the table. So just to go through the detail of each of those options, the first one is, sorry, before we do that, just a reminder about the factors that we need to keep in mind as we're going through considering the options that are in front of us. So the first one is that communities of interest criteria. What are the distinct communities of interest across the district? What are their characteristics, and how does the representation structure enable you as elected members to effectively represent those communities? So that also means looking at effective representation. What's the structure that works? What's the right number of members? And just included again there, just as a reminder, the comparison with some other councils of similar size in terms of the number of councillors. And then we also have the fair representation test. That's the plus or minus 10% requirement. So that's about ensuring that there's that equality of representation per member across all of the wards. The question came up last time about remuneration, and yes, that is a factor for you to consider, and it's in the back of your minds, but quite clear guidance from the Local Government Commission that that's not a primary factor that should be used in determining representation arrangements. Okay, so what we've called option 0, the do nothing option, just to refresh on that, is effectively retaining the current status for wards exactly as they are, with no changes proposed, and 11 councillors. Looking at the population per member ratios, we do note that Parongia Kakipuku would fall slightly outside the plus or minus 10% requirement, but there is no need to do anything about that if you decide not to proceed with the representation review. So that option is on the table and can proceed exactly as it is with council taking no further action. So that's one option to remain on the table. Option one was effectively the same structure, keeping the 4 wards, but making that boundary adjustment to bring the Parongia Kakipuku ward into alignment with the plus or minus 10%. And that is possible. We have done some initial modelling around that. Joe, do you want to just talk about what that boundary change might look like in terms of option one to bring us into alignment?
What we looked at, I'll make sure you stand up, is potentially taking from here, these 3 over here, which are where you've got some of your current growth cells. So there was a number of people that we could take from there that was around 300 or 400 that would work to make that adjustment work in terms of the numbers and make sense in terms of the fact that the growth is happening out that way. So it all aligned and sat quite well with that one.
Great, thanks, Joe.
Could I just ask a question there? So those 300, they'd be mostly rural properties. Is that right in Parongia Kakipuku ward?
Those
That you just sort of pointed.
that was where your current, where your growth cells out the other side, like Frontier Estate, that other side
Tilmutu.
out.
Oh, that way. Yep.
Yep, out
I'm
that way.
actually- Yep.
Yeah, it was on the outskirts of
Yeah.
Tilmutu. Yeah.
Thanks, Joe. We can just look again then at option 2, and this is the new and different option. The proposal to create a combined rural ward and reduce the number of councillors to 8. Again, looking at the population tables for this option, we see that there's again a slight out of alignment with the plus or minus 10%, with the new combined rural ward needing a little bit of massaging and some boundary change to bring that across the line. So let's just flick on, Joe, to the population table. Option 2, yep. So the new combined rural ward would have 2 members. The Cambridge ward, general ward, would have 3. The Awamutu Kihikihi 2 for a total of 7 general ward members, and for the Māori ward 1 member for a total of 8. So as we mentioned, this would require a minor boundary adjustment so that ward would come into alignment with the plus or minus 10%. And again, we've looked at some options there. So Joe, if you want to just talk about those, that would be great.
Thank you. I'll just flick back to here so I can point out. So we'll be taking this area up on the other side of the highway and the other side of Karapiro village, because that seemed quite good linkages and was the approximate amount of numbers, and it just seems to kind of quite tidy up that ward, and it makes it makes sense if you're extending out to include that other parts of Karapiro and maybe the other side of the other side of the highway, so that long kind of skinnier loopy bit there. Technical term,
Yeah. Highly technical local government term, that loopy bit.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, we thought that was quite an elegant solution, really, and one that fitted well with the communities of interest. So that, meeting the fair representation test, but also the communities of interest. So all the other wards would be compliant under those numbers. Obviously, the Māori ward would remain district-wide. And again, as per your views from the last workshop, no other changes, and the community boards would be retained under that structure. Okay. In terms of other options, there were, suggestions, as we saw coming through from the preliminary engagement, for some different rural ward splits. We'll look at those in a couple of moments. But again, just point out that there's not a lot of time left for staff to undertake the population modelling that would be needed to bring any new or significantly different options to the table. Boundaries need to be mapped to mesh blocks, so there's quite a bit of GIS work involved. We need to request updated population data from Stats NZ and undertake some initial analysis around looking at, well, what are the communities of interest and how do those work? And obviously any new options now would not have the opportunity for taking those out to preliminary engagement. But, there is the option of considering some of those. So just a reminder, I guess, about from the 2021 representation review, there were a range of splits that were considered at that time. In most cases, they were considered either not able to meet the communities of interest test, so they were combining or splitting areas that didn't really fit together. And I think one of the key things is that with your current view that you'd like to see a smaller number of councillors, it's unlikely that these options would be compliant with the plus or minus 10% at this stage. But without doing more detailed modelling, it's not possible to say definitively. Again, Joe, I don't know if you've got any comments on any of those matters.
No, not at this point. I think those options were quite well canvassed last time.
Great. Okay, so I guess just to refresh you on sort of where to from here, and then it's really open for discussion. So again, what we're looking for is clear steer in terms of guidance to staff on which direction you would like us to develop for bringing an initial proposal back to you. And Joe, perhaps if you just talk through the timeline from that point.
So there would be a additional Finance and Corporate Committee meeting on the 30th of July to resolve the initial proposal. Not long after that, we'd be able to open up consultation for a month. That Wednesday, the 25th of September, sit down for hearings and deliberations. That would be at Finance and Corporate. That would be a special meeting, so it wouldn't be attached to your current scheduled Finance and Corporate meeting. Would need a separate day, or probably half a day for that. And then also looking just in terms of the way that the timelines flow, because you've got to be able to kind of advertise your final submission within 8 weeks of closing your submissions, looking to adopt at that council meeting on the 15th of October, which has been set up to adopt the annual report. If you've had hearings and deliberations on the 25th of September, the 15th of October should be a relatively short item. Any questions on that timeline?
No, thanks, Joe. Now, Philip, did you have a question you wanted to ask?
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks for your report or presentation, Stephen. A question I had a couple of slides ago, sort of midway between your presentation, was you had examples of other councils with similar populations and councils and things, councillors and what have you. Of those examples that you've got there, yeah, that one. How many are doing a review like us? Because they're all very similar, as you pointed out and showed, similar populations and similar amount of councillors. how many of those are doing a review this time round?
Quite a number of them are. I know that Tasman and Napier are certainly doing so. Western BOP, Waimakariri is not doing a review this time around. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Some of those numbers may change, and yeah, so it's a fluid situation and changing each round of reviews.
So approximately half. Your guess, sort of thing?
That's just a guess, yeah. Sorry, without going back and checking the records. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So you're seeking questions or discussion now, Joe and Stephen?
Yes, please.
People, now's your time to discuss this. Not a very eloquent way of putting it, but who's going to kick me off? Claire.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Look, I was pretty heartened by the feedback that we got, actually, because I felt that a lot of people would understand the point that we were making, that reducing the number of councillors doesn't mean that the representation itself would be reduced or sparse or, suffer. In fact, a number of them signalled that they're looking forward to more of that participatory kind of processes that we've tried. Yeah, so it came through clearly. I think that people want that rural voice maintained. And in fact, yeah, there were questions about whether or not that could be done effectively. So I guess I would like to understand that a bit more. Yeah, but I wasn't too concerned about the representation from Cambridge and Te Awamutu. I think that seemed to be, that's sat fine with me. Yeah.
Thanks, Claire. Roger online has a comment to make or a question to put.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, thanks for the report, Stephen. I am of the opinion, though, that 59 submissions is not really a huge level of interest. In fact, it works out to be something like 0.1% of the population, which, if you look at it alternatively, it tells us that 99.9% of our population are really not interested in the review, and there's not enough of a feeling in the community for a review to take place. One thing that does, and I mean that is also supported by the appropriate representation answer, which says even of those that have answered, it's basically split 50-50, 28 yes, 28 no. So I'm not seeing sufficient evidence for the need. My other challenge that we've got is that the three models that we're looking at, and that includes 0, 1, and 2, the information we've been given is actually based on incorrect and I suppose invalid population data, because we have got the census figures now out, and it tells us, whereas in our modelling here we've used 61,250, the actual population is 58,686. Now that's quite a considerable difference, and could make, because we don't know how that's split, we know that the growth has been higher from the figures we saw yesterday. The growth has been higher in Cambridge and lesser in TA, and it's not going to take much variation for the quota to give us a different picture. And David, although you mentioned that we'd go back to Stats New Zealand and ask for updates on the population, we already know that the detail that will give us the population at the SA1 and SA2 areas, which will enable us to get ward definition of population, they're not going to be available until the end of the year, until September, which is really too late. So I just question whether, in fact, if we went with a model that was proven in future to be invalid against the quota allocation, that it would leave us open for a review. I just take a couple of comments that came out from the feedback that we've got. And I've got to say that there was one that that states that the review at this time is a needless and a huge waste of staff resources and councillor time. And I tend to be of a similar opinion to that. I don't think there's sufficient valid rationale for us to spend this time and resource in going through the process. And there's another comment that says the current structure has been in place for about 18 months only, hardly enough time to assess its effectiveness. I mean, admittedly, I've only picked out 2 comments from the community, but they are 2 that kind of drew my attention. So I'm not so sure that we've got sufficient rationale to go forward with the review.
Thank you for that, Roger. Any other comments around the table? Monty?
Yeah, just I have a bit of a concern with the combined rural ward. I've got to be honest. It doesn't quite gel with communities of interest for me, and I was hoping we were going to be able to engineer an east-west split, because I sort of have this intuitive feeling that there is a difference between being a rural person who associates with Cambridge as your town and a rural person who associates with Te Awamutu as your town. I definitely feel that myself. I've kind of felt that all my life. I'm not into tribal governance, but it is really good to ensure that you've got this spread of perspectives. So, yeah, that's a little disappointing for me that we haven't been able to engineer that. I kind of thought we might be able to get there, and so, yeah, I have a concern on that. Okay.
Philip?
Yeah, thank you. And just carrying on from Roger's comments that he just pointed out, we've done reviews the last 2 terms, and here we are again doing it again, and the population may think we've got other more important things to do, and it'd be really, I suppose, would it be frustrating or whatever the word would be to have to turn around if we decided then to do another review in 3 years' time to increase it or whatever, because the numbers are growing or whatever. But yeah, just to do we've done 2 reviews previously, and to do one again so soon when it's not required, then yeah, I'm just picking up that comment too. Yeah.
Any other commentary? Mike Pettit?
Can we just go back to the why? Because there was some fairly solid reasons I thought we were doing this. So just through the mayor, can we just go over those again and then just maybe give some comment on that?
So I raised this matter with us, and I challenged us to consider how we could be better governors, more professional governors, more dedicated governors. Because you've got to consider this question in the context of local government change and reform, a lot of uncertainties around what's left here, potentially if there is to be a three-water aggregated service delivery model, bearing in mind the urgence in our commitment to an anchor institution. So I guess it would have been remiss of us to have not considered how we as an elected body could be better and do better for our communities. And I'm really concerned that with the idea that as we grow, we just keep slapping on more people around this table does not make better representation or better governors. So that was the question I sort of put to us as a group. How can we do better for our communities? And the hope being that if there was a reduced number, that people could have the ability around this table to commit themselves more fully and wholly to the job at hand, which, as I recall, Councillor St Pierre stressed was a far cry now from what it was 5 years ago even. It's not a part-time job, as you guys all know. Let's be honest, it's not part-time. And I think we owe it to our communities to actually commit ourselves greater than that. So this was a mechanism to be honest about that and see if we could pull together an arrangement that honoured that and gave justice to the time committed and needed, and for the roles to be completed properly for the benefit of our communities.
I'll just make comment to that. So thanks for that. Just to I guess just reiterate that. Yeah, one saying I've heard is hope is not a strategy. But I hear what you're saying. So whether this does come off or doesn't, I think what we are hearing is the people who stand at the next election need to have the time in this ever-changing world and I guess local politics to actually put more time into this position than if you've got like myself, a full-time job basically. So I think that's heard loud and clear, and I totally support that. So whether this goes through or not, and the community support it or not, I think the message is the same. That the people who stand need to, in this changing world, need to understand that this job is increasingly taking a lot of time. And you've got to have the time to actually commit to it. Now, that doesn't actually mean that you're retired or you haven't got other commitments, because one risk in this for me is that I would hate to see people give up some of their other commitments. And I'm not talking work ones, but commitments of passion or community service and that sort of thing, that these roles take so much time that really all you end up with is this one-dimensional sort of councillor. So that's just a heads up, whichever way it spins. I'm comfortable with it. It's more about who stands at the next election. I think there needs to be some real clarity around what the job, because that's really what it is, does entail.
Yeah, some great comments there, Mike. And can I just, for context, point out that I'm part of a LGNZ electoral reform working group with a couple of other mayors, and one of our biggest focus areas is to sort of crack the nut and understand what is happening in terms of increasing voter participation. How do we do that? And we're going to come back to LGNZ with an issues paper and eventually a positions paper, but certainly voter participation, voting mechanisms, how elections are administered and run, and implementation and transition to four-year term are all kind of live topics for LGNZ at the moment. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, are we brave enough to actually take some control of our own destiny as an organisation and be honest about what we can offer to our communities? Liz and then Lou.
Thanks, Susan. And look, a lot of what you're saying absolutely resonates with me, and Mike, a lot of what you said as well. So I guess from my perspective, it's all around the quality of the people that are around the table. And for the general public who are voting elected members in, that can be really, really difficult when you don't know them and you're relying on a photo and 150 words to decide who will govern your district. And yesterday alone in our workshop, we had some really important information that we need to constantly grapple with as we continue in our high growth sort of council position that we're in. So the quality of the councillors for me is really, really paramount. And that's why I've been largely supportive of reducing the number, because I think we do need to commit more time. The demand, the energy required to be across all issues and provide a really good decision making is what we owe all of our ratepayers. So for me, the issue is around the process. And when we look at how we get elected, there's no vetting. And I look at corporate companies, and they do have a vetting process. And I really want, if we're going to be really, if we're going to make some really positive changes, we need to help our communities decide who are the best people around the table. And I'd really like to see a new system work alongside this representation review where we consider how we do independently or within our own organisation vet the candidates who are putting their names forward. I quote actually Ray Milner. He had a letter to the editor last week, which I thought was really good. His last sentence resonated with me. And after all, he said, 2 or 3 poor quality populist councillors on a council of 11 can do far less damage than 2 or 3 out of 8. And that's really important. So if we were to create a process, and I'm going to ask Monty to maybe outline some key things that I know Fonterra do to help our community decide who are the best candidates. So it's just something I kind of wanted to raise in this forum. I think it's really important. It was the biggest, I guess, reason I think people don't vote. They simply don't know who the quality candidates are. So Monty, would you mind, because you're really familiar with the Fonterra candidate sort of vetting process, just sort of outline, because I know you're really all over that stuff.
Yeah, sure. Is that right, Susan?
Yeah, absolutely.
This was my baby at Fonterra, okay? I chaired the guardianship committee, and Fonterra is a democratically controlled organisation, okay, of 10,000 farmers. So like most corporate boards, we had a skills matrix, which identifies a skills and attributes list, actually, that the current board is marked against with this matrix. So they identify what they want, they identify what they've got, and then potential candidates, this is where we could do whatever we wanted in the corporate world. We had potential candidates assessed by an independent assessment panel of expert New Zealand governors who published their findings to the voters. And they didn't tell you who to vote for, but you could read between the lines pretty easily. So look, I imagine that's a hell of a lot further than local government's ever going to go, but that's what was happening in a cooperative. And what we were trying to do is get this perfect balance between democratic control, but also informed shareholders who could vote for the skills required to make a board work really well. Because, I mean, everyone can kind of observe that in local government, it is a bit of a name recognition contest. You know, I know for years and years and years, the list would come on, I don't know any of these people, and you tend to just tick the ones you knew. There is definitely an element of that. So that's how we got to in Fonterra. It's not directly applicable, but it's a indication of both how the corporate and sort of the cooperative world was working.
The process for candidates is heavily prescribed in our legislation. So this is the area that you're talking about now is an area where you're looking at probably advocating for legislative reform, because that's not something that we can do currently. So I'd encourage you, if that is something that you're minded to do, to go through your channels to advocate for electoral reform in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as I say, involved in this electoral reform working group. So, I mean, if you want to provide me with, a sort of proposition, I've got no issue with distributing that to the members for their consideration. Dale Marie, did you want to speak? And then Marcus, and then Liz. Oh, sorry, Claire, rather. Oh, sorry, Lou. Sorry, Lou, and then Dale Marie.
I wanted to just make a couple of comments here. Firstly, we've just been through what happened in Tauranga. We had Antoli was appointed. They had a board appointed, and they have rejected that. The Tauranga population have rejected the idea of a board simply because they lost connection. And having a lot of friends over there said that they had no direct connection with the board. The board made its decisions as a board. And it's going in an operational area where they and the staff collaborated to create the infrastructure that they wanted. But the local population felt that they were totally disenfranchised. Now, what are we? We are a governance issue, but we're not a board. We are elected to represent the people of our district. And a lot of people died out there to have that thing called democracy. And that, to me, is where you have this appointment. The other big elephant in the room is that we have a fairly involved environment. I agree with that. How much reading I do, how much I sit down and exercise every day. And we're not remunerated. You will not get a quality people unless our remuneration almost doubles or trebles. No director will sit down for 50,000 or 60,000 or even 70,000. You've got to pay people, and the big constraint there is that pot that is set by LNGZ. It's set, so we haven't got the wherewithal to actually move that forward. My feeling is that we're living in an environment at the moment where we're constrained, heavily constrained financially, and we should be thinking about the fact that we're getting very close to our limit under borrowing, etc. All of this costs money. All of this is going to have impact. We don't have to do anything at the moment. We can actually sit this out until we've seen the legislation on Maori Wharf, which can have quite an impact, and also to see what the government's talking about with the financing of local government. Because I do know that there is, as I say, a problem that if we get people on a governance mode, not been on governance, and sat in boards, and the biggest thing you're looking at is not the actual population, but actually the survival of the company. You're there to actually make sure that you make a profit and you make good decisions for the company.
Thank you, Lou. Dale Marie.
Tēnā tātou, just quickly, and knowing that Mairuruhi and my kaumātua are here today, and I think my kaumātua was here when the establishment of the Māori Ward decision was accepted by Waipa. And just honestly, I'd really love to sit here like the rest of my peers and not have to worry about representation, in effect, because I know that you guys can sit here with detail, whereas I sit here with uncertainty. I wish we could apply a matrix to the people in central government when we're talking about things like this, because for me, the legislative and the statutory requirements that sit within this district and across Tainui Waka, where we have these amazing co-governance and magic can happen around these tables when there is Māori representation in this country. So I have to put that on and put a mark in the sand. That isn't against anybody in this room, because I know that complete blame is left with Pōneke, but I cannot sit here and be quiet, especially with my whānau in the room. Tēnā tātou.
Thank you, Dale Marie. Marcus and then Claire, I'm just mindful of the time, so keep your comments succinct, please.
I'm quite torn after hearing like Liz and Claire. I think that having a separation of the rural ward to east and west is quite fair. I quite like how Tauranga City has now, with their candidates, they've interviewed each candidate and put it on their website, which is really good because that goes towards education of the general public about a set of questions, and people can get a view, and it's way better than anything we've ever done to get people introduced and ratepayers to the candidates, which I think is awesome, and I hope we do that next year. But yeah, how do you get? If we reduce down to 8 and then we get some dud candidates, that's I hadn't thought of that, but that's actually a real concern. So I'm pretty torn, really, and I think no matter what we decide, and with our best intentions here, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because it's up to the Joe public to put their hands up to stand for council, and I don't think at the moment, I mean, the people who are really keen and strategic thinking and stuff probably wouldn't want to touch the barge pole anyway, because the financial rewards aren't there.
Well, so, that's a good marketing slogan, Marcus. Thank you. Thank you. Wouldn't want to touch it with a barge pole. Byline for Waipa District Council. Thanks. I guess from where I sit, this is a piece. This isn't a silver bullet. This is not going to fix it all, but it's the bit that we can control around what sits around here, and it's a combination of solutions and hopefully fixes and things that could enable there to be greater participation, a greater step up in terms of broader strategic thinkers around this table that deliver excellent, cool outcomes from our community, alongside that participatory democracy piece, really high functioning community boards. I'm thinking a lot bigger here than just self-preservation, which sadly will come into some people's thinking in this discussion. But anyway, Claire, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. It's been a really good discussion. And It is really difficult. I mean, I agree with Marcus. It's difficult to sort of see a clear way forward in this. I guess I would like to see, like with the proposals, the reduction, but if possible, have that east-west split for the rural, but it's not possible.
No,
you know.
no, we tried to, with the options that we've been able to come up with, we did try with that solution of extending up Mangatautari to include Ohaupo and up to the Hamilton border. But there were still too many people left in Parongia and Kakapuku to warrant dealing with doing any detailed modelling. I had about 1,000 people too many, which is you can't disperse them easily, and that was not even taking communities of interest. That was just trying to draw a map to put as many in Mangatautari as I could, and still had 1,000 too many in Parongia and Kakapuku. So it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
So the option that would come back on the 30th of July in terms of if you want the reduced number of councillors will be the combined rural ward.
Yeah. Okay. So I just wanted to address some other things. One was that Roger mentioned, is this a good idea to do it when we're not certain about the population figures? But I actually think we've got enough to work on, and so I'm comfortable with the information that we have, because it's all about proportional and that kind of thing. And I do accept that Cambridge is growing more strongly, but I think that, you know, the options are a reasonable reflection of that. I wanted to sort of echo or catch on to what you were saying, Susan, about it's a broader picture that we're sort of painting here with the way democracy works in our community. Sure, the number of councillors that are around the table is one thing, and I'd just like to say it's been awesome to have a Māori ward councillor around the table in the last, in our term, which is really great. But there are other things, like high functioning community boards, other processes that can get, I suppose, that really high level of engagement with particular interests, or, like, for instance, disabilities and things like that, or youth or the older people and things. So, so I'm not seeing it in isolation. And also, we're probably not going to, as you said, get it right on the button first time. It's going to be an evolution as well. But I still think it's the right way to go. So I'm sort of supportive of the overall idea. Hoping that we'll be able to work something out for the rural people that will be acceptable to them.
Thanks, Claire. I know we talk regularly about communities of interest, and I just sort of thought, well, what is really a community of interest? And it's a concentration of population which shares common social and economic interests that should be included within a single district for the purposes of its effective and fair representation. And I guess as a rural person, who I've always been rural my whole life, farmer, as much as I think I have more commonalities with other farmers potentially, or other rural dwellers within our district, irrespective of where they're geographically located. I think my social and economic interests are more aligned with them than they probably are with an urban dweller. So I hear your point. It would have been nice if we'd had this pretty little division of east-west, just because of this historical bind to towns that you go and do your grocery shopping in and get your RD1 supplies from. But I guess ultimately I try and draw on our commonalities and in terms of those social and economic interests that are aligned. So look, I don't want to labour the point any longer, because I think we've had a really good chat. I kind of. Is there anybody else that really is going to die in a ditch over not being heard? Andrew?
Yeah, very quickly. Look, I think a smaller group certainly signals the fact that we're looking at a far more than a part-time job sitting around this table. But I also agree with Lou. We simply don't have the finances to actually pay for a full-time job. But a smaller group of people signals that I think clearly that we're looking for more contribution from each person.
Thanks, Andrew. Bruce?
Thanks, Susan. I've only got one thing to say, and it does concern me, reduction in the rural ward councillors. It's big enough now where I'm going from the south of Hamilton right down to just about wherever, and to get to anyone. And I think of the 9 submitters from our ward, 2 or 3 of them said, well, they don't see representation's a big issue. And number two is, as we say, remuneration, which we can't discuss. The ones I've been trying to do in the time I've been here, and succession planning sort of thing for this job, I wouldn't want your job for a quid. What's it pay? So you won't get the right people here ever. You know, we're lucky with what we've got, the quality of councillors.
Mayor Susan, could I
So,
come in with a
no.
last comment?
Oh, no, Roger, you had a fairly extensive shot at the title
Oh, I
earlier.
think
Sorry, we're
it's-
just
I
really pressed
do
for
believe
time
it-
here.
It's
So-
yes, I know, but it is, I think, a relevant point, which nobody has mentioned just yet. It'll take me just a minute. And I think it's a risk of unfair representation. If we look at 8 councillors and 1 rural councillor, the rural population is quite strongly, as we can see from our current ward structure, twice as great on the TA side than it is on the Mangatautari side, and hence there is a chance that the 2 rural councillors could come from that part of the region. Also, the Maori population is very strongly more resident in TA than it is in Cambridge, so there's a strong likelihood that the Maori councillor could be resident over there. So if that were the case, there's a risk that the representation around an 8-person council could be 5 people from the west side.
Look,
3
Roger, I'm going to
people
interrupt
from
you
the
there
eastern
because
side.
I think you're concerned about things that might not ever happen. And we're more concerned about what actually is rather than what might be in terms of your estimations. So look, I think we have to wrap this up. We've had some pretty thorough discussions here, and Joe needs a steer, obviously, as it appears on our page 22 of our presentation booklet there. You want guidance on a preferred option. So I guess we're going to have to go for a show of hands on this one, just to give a little bit of a steer, because I'm not getting a one way or the other. I'm picking it's reasonably divided. I guess I just want to sort of emphasise that, and it was a note that Stephen mentioned right at the beginning, was that this pre-engagement is only that, pre-engagement. And secondly, it's only one of a very large number of issues that will be taken into account when the time comes to make these decisions. So I guess if we decided today to proceed, it just keeps the matter alive. If we decide not to proceed, it kills it completely. Okay? So I'm asking whether you're going to be brave enough and honest enough about our own performance as an elected member group, and can we do better? That's where I'll leave it. So with that said, just looking at our options here, we really have just the 3, I suppose, don't we? Change or no change. So can I get a steer as to whether people are keen for a change or not? So if you're not, stick up your hand. If you're not keen for a change, because this is it, right? Not status quo, keeping it the same. Roger's a status quo, keeping it the same, and Lou, and Bruce, and Philip. So that means the changes win in terms. Oh, you're up. Are you trying to status quo as well, Mike?
But there's 3 options.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'm
yes,
just trying
no,
to
or
ascertain.
abstain.
Pardon?
Well, surely we've got the right to abstain because I just.
It's a workshop, isn't it?
Yeah, well,
We need to give staff a steer. This is
Yeah,
the
I
whole
just-
point around this body of work. Yeah, Liz.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are probably feeling we haven't had enough conversation yet around the table. Have we got another half an hour to just keep talking? Or I'm just suggesting that as a option. I'm happy to be overruled, but
Sorry, there's a rather important staff training exercise.
I don't know if it helps that when the paper comes back of it on the 30th of July, obviously there will be the option that will still be in the paper that if you don't want to proceed, you can choose to not proceed because you won't then support the initial proposal that comes forward. As we have gone out for some pre-engagement and engage with the community, I think it's important that at some point, even, you know, that even if you weren't to proceed, that feedback is actually presented on an agenda at a meeting item. So we would look at having to have a meeting item anyway. So there is still, there will still be those options on the 30th of July. I just wanted to make sure that was still, everyone was still aware of that.
What's the feeling? Adjourn this and reconvene it after lunch? Or?
I'm happy to show of hands now.
Yeah.
It's not a vote.
It's not a vote, and we've still got, I think the fact that we're just proceeding to the next step,
Yeah.
I think that made me
That's
feel
really
a bit
what
more
I'm trying to
comfortable.
keep the issue alive, is or understand whether there's an appetite to keep the issue alive or
Yep.
cut it off at the post.
I'm happy with that.
So can I just get an indication whether we are happy to keep this matter alive as per Joe's indication just before? Do you want to repeat that, Joe, or? Yep. Keep the issue alive. Come back to July.
Comes back to July, but there'll still be the option, there'll be an initial proposal and the recommendations, but you know, in the body of the report, it will talk about the status quo option, which will still be that you don't proceed with the representation review. So you'll still be able to vote.
Are you happy to keep the matter alive, Claire? Yes, she is. So I think that we have a majority who are happy to keep the matter alive and proceed on the basis of Joe's indication just before. Thank you very much, team. Sorry for it got a little bit messy at the end, but we got there eventually, right? Look, I will just